Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio and welcome back to our Enemy AI mini-series. It took us 5 videos to get our first enemy up and running, but now, thanks to this much more modular system, we're able to create the second enemy in just 2 videos. And so in this video, we're going to finish off our flyer. We're going to add a death state as well as get him set up to fire some projectiles. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Alright, so in our current system, we have the ability to damage our enemy. However, when his health gets down below 0, nothing's currently happening. In the last video, we did set up a death animation and create a state in our animator. We just don't have any way for it to ever get called. We're not going to do an entire dedicated death state here, as our enemies do just destroy themselves when they died. However, we do need a way to actually play their death animation. So if we head into our enemy damage, you can see that we already call this handle death method whenever they die, and this one will spew out death parts if they have them. However, in this case, we're trying a different tack for this enemy where we want him to play an animation instead. So let's just say here that if death parts length equals 0, then let's just tell our enemy to play his death animation. Then we can destroy him after a set amount of time. In this case, I'm going to do 1 second, as that is longer than the animation itself. Now I'm going to return here, which just means I won't execute any more logic, though if you want to play death parts and an animation, you could just leave the return out so that both happen. Now back in Unity, I'm just going to take a second to set my enemy's health to 2 so that he'll die in 1 hit. And now when I hit him, you'll notice that the kobold parts still go flying, since this prefab was copied from that kobold. So let's just turn this off. We'll head into our damage here and make sure that we remove those death parts. Now when we hit play, things work a little better, except that our animation will be repeatedly looping. So again, let's pause and just go down to our animation clip here and make sure to take off loop time. Now it's looking much better. Alright, with our death state working, now we're ready to get started on our projectile. We'll begin by creating a new state for this, so let's head to our enemy states where we create a new mono behavior script called ranged attack state. As usual, let's get rid of our start and update method and make sure that we are inheriting from state instead of mono behavior. We can then go ahead and create our constructor, a public ranged attack state that will take in an enemy reference called enemy, and then we'll pass that reference along to the base state. Now we're just going to start with a bare bones version of the state that will play an animation. So let's create our protected override string for the anim bool, and we'll call this one isShooting. Then we'll just make our override method for enter. Here we want to call the base state's enter method so it runs all of its logic. And the only other thing we're going to do here for now is just make our rigid body's velocity go to 0 so that he doesn't move once he starts shooting. Now in order to test this, we need to actually call it from somewhere. And the most common place that we'll enter our shooting state is from chase. So let's head into chase state. And here we'll just come down after number 2, which is where we check for a melee attack, as we'll want that to be the priority. However, if he is too far away to melee attack, we'll want a ranged attack. So we'll just add a 3rd step here to check if we can ranged attack. I'll just update my numbers then so that they still match in sequence. Now our logic to enter a ranged attack will be very similar to what we do for melee, so we can copy and paste that. We'll just change this then so that we'll check if the target is in shooting range. We'll actually just leave this can melee attack for now, as we're going to add that check a little bit later. And then we'll come down below and just make sure that if we are in shooting range, that we head to ranged attack state. Now this check in senses for shooting range doesn't exist yet, so we're going to have to create that. So inside of enemy senses, let's scroll down to where our is in melee range method is, and we can actually just copy and paste that for now, and change it to is in shooting range, as it's going to work almost identical, except that this time our return isn't going to check if distance is less than config's melee range. Instead, we're going to check our ranged range. Now that doesn't exist yet either, so we're going to have to just pop over to our config in a moment. However, before we leave here, let's just update our onDraw gizmo so that it's correct. We can come down here and once again copy our melee check. We'll just change this one to a ranged check. Let's use a color of, say, green, and then also update our gizmo so that rather than checking config's melee range, it checks the ranged range. All right, let's head over to our config where we can take care of that error of the ranged range not existing. Here, I'll come below our regular attack and just create a new header for ranged attack. And we'll go ahead and make a public float called ranged range, which I'll just default at 5. And while we're here, let's set up all of our other parameters for our ranged attack as well. So we're going to need a public integer for our ranged damage. Let's create a float for our ranged cooldown, which I'll just initialize to 2. We'll also make a public game object for our projectile's prefab. We'll need yet another float for our projectile speed and a final one for the projectile's lifetime. I'll then just initialize these with some values. With that done, that should clear up the errors we were getting in our senses. Now we already set up our attack animation last video, and since this enemy doesn't have a melee attack, we're going to use that for our shooting. We can head to our animator, and I'll just locate the flyer attack and drag it up here. At this point we can make a transition that goes in, and then another one that leaves our attack state. And here I'm going to just create a new bool like we do for most of our states. We'll call this one is shooting. I'm just going to move it up top for ease of access, and then on this first transition, we'll head in when is shooting is true, and then we'll leave with no exit time or transition duration whenever is shooting is false. Finally, I'm just going to name this to something more generic that will work for any future enemies. Let's just call it shooting. Now before we test, let's just go to our flyer's enemy script here and open up his config. I'm going to zero out his melee attack value so that he never enters a melee attack state. And I just want to show you something to be clear on it. I'm going to set my ranged attack to a large amount. You'll notice it's larger than his chase range. Now when we get in the game, he will enter his ranged attack state, great, but you'll notice that he didn't do it when he entered his ranged range. He waited till he got inside of the chase range. Now the main reason for that is just because chase state is the only one that has a transition into ranged attack, and we will add more transitions to some other states later. That said, for the moment, I'm just going to make sure that our chase range is always larger than our ranged attack range. Alright, with that done, we're ready to actually create this projectile, as our ranged attack state is currently pretty boring. So first off, I'm just going to search up the projectile from Matsart's Flying 2D Demon here, and let's set up the sprite itself. We'll use 16 pixels per unit, set it 2.0 filter, and also use 32-bit format. With that done, we can drag it up into our scene. I'll make sure that I move it over by the enemy himself here, and since it's currently oriented the wrong way, let's set it to a scale of -1 on the X. Next, let's add a capsule collider 2D here. I'm going to set mine to a horizontal direction, and then just an important note, I always make my colliders a little smaller than the damaging object itself, that way the player never feels cheated, as a close call will always go in his favor. We'll then add a rigid body 2D. The only thing here is I'm just going to take off gravity by putting a 0 there. Next, let's just head into our enemies folder here, and I'm going to create a general multi-purpose script for projectile. I'm also just going to click on my fireball before I have a chance to forget, and we'll add that projectile component now. Now we won't be using the update method, so we can get rid of that one just to keep things clean, and then let's come up top and declare some variables. First of all, our projectile is going to need to know what it's looking for. Here I'm going to make a serialized private layer mask field, which we'll call ground layer. We'll then make another layer mask, this time for the target layer, so that it knows when it's hit the player or other possible future targets. With that done, we'll just make a couple of properties here. And in this case, we'll make one a float for lifetime, and we'll start it off with a default of 5. We'll then make another float, this one for damage, and we'll just give it a default of 1 in case for some reason we forget to set its value later. Now in start, we're just going to tell this object that it needs to destroy itself as soon as its lifetime runs out. Next up, we just want to use our onTriggerEnter2D method in order to detect whenever our projectile hits something. Here we're going to use a bitwise operator, which is a strange syntactic but very effective way to compare layers. All it does is shift the value of the collision layer into binary, so 1s or 0s, and then compares that to the target layer we're looking for, in this case the ground layer. Now at the end of that comparison, if there are 0 matches, we'll skip over this next block. However, if there's not 0, then that means we've hit a ground layer and we want to destroy the projectile game object. We'll also put a return here, as we don't need to evaluate any further because it's done, it's destroyed. Now next, we're going to want to do a check with almost the exact same logic to see if the projectile has hit our target layer. I do notice here my mistake up above, so I'm just going to fix the typo there. And then when I come down below, we're going to make one little change this time, and that is we're going to put equals equals instead of does not equal. And essentially just if it's hit something that's not the player, we're just going to return. We don't need to execute any special logic. However, and this will be our final piece of logic here, if we have in fact hit the player, then we want to deal some damage. So to do that, we'll first have to find his health script. So we'll make a variable here for health, which will be equal to the collisions, and here we'll just get component in children and type in health so that we get the health script. Now if that worked and we actually found a health script, then we'll just tell our health that we want to change health, and here we'll just pass along a negative version of our damage as well as the position of the projectile. Finally, we can destroy this projectile. And here I just made one other spelling mistake. It seems to have auto-corrected my health to a lowercase health here in my get component check. So let's just fix that. Now when I pop into Unity, I do notice one little error here coming from our projectile. That's just that up top I made damage into a float, but our health script uses integers. So we'll just change that quickly here. Now, unfortunately, we're still a little ways from anything testable. Let's head back into our ranged attack state now and continue moving towards actually being able to launch that fireball. Here, we'll need our public override void update method. Now, in here, we can set up our conditions for leaving this state. So, for example, if our senses get chase target returns a actual value, then we want to tell our state machine to change state into the chase state again. That said, if it doesn't find a target, we'll tell our state machine that it needs to go back to idling. Now that said, we don't want our enemy to immediately transfer out of this state, so we're going to need a flag that will know once he's actually fired his projectile. So let's come up top here and create a private bool, and we can just call this one attack finished. Now back with our melee attack, we already created an override method for on animation finish that gets messages sent to it from our animations, and we'll just reuse that here, so that as soon as our animation says it's done shooting, it'll tell this to set attack finish to true. Then we'll just come to when we first enter this state, and of course when we enter, attack finished should be false. Now, when we go to update, we can just put the flag in here, so that if the attack is not finished, we don't run the rest of our update method. Back in Unity, we can see how this works by clicking on our flyer and looking at his attack animation. The first one here fires an event, but the one we want is the last, and whenever we hit this point, we want to tell our enemy to play its method for on animation finished, which will allow him then to leave the state. Now when we get in the game, we'll notice that he pretends to fire at us, immediately leaves the state, but since we're still in range, he tries to attack again, and since there's no cooldown, he's just going to do this on repeat. The logical step at this point then is to give him a cooldown. So let's head into our enemy combat. And here you'll notice that we actually already set up a property here for can melee attack, which just checks if the current time is greater than the last time we attacked plus our melee cooldown. And now we'll just make the identical method, but for ranged attack, checking if the current time is greater than our last attack time plus our ranged cooldown. Now we just need to make sure that we're actually using this for our transitions. So now then in chase state, we can just make sure that we're checking our combat's can ranged attack instead of the melee one. At this point then I'm just actually going to copy this entire method and let's set up our transitions from other states. For example, if we're in the idle state, here we can come down again after we've checked for a melee target and just paste this right in. Then all I want to do here is just make sure my comments numbers are correct. That should be the only change we need to do here. Alright, with that little change, our cooldown will now be working, as you'll notice he flies close after attacking since he can't attack again yet and has to wait. The only thing missing, of course, is the projectile, so let's get that happening. Now, most of our projectile magic will be coming from our enemy combat, so let's scroll down here below our perform melee attack and create another method, this one perform ranged attack. And this will be called from the animation through an event, so I'll just put a note to indicate this. So first of all, similar to perform melee attack, anytime we shoot a projectile, we want to set our last attack time so that it's up to date. Now this part gets just a little mathy as we need to calculate a direction and some angles. So we'll start by setting a vector 2 for our fire direction. Here we'll just take our enemy's current target position and subtract the attack point's position. So find out the difference between where it needs to go and where it's coming from, and then we'll normalize that value. Now at this point we don't have a current target set in our enemy, so we're going to need to quickly set that up. So we'll head over to our enemy script and just make a public transform reference called current target. And again, here we'll set this one up as a property to give it extra protection, especially since we don't need to see it in the inspector anyways. Now we just need to make sure that we actually set this value. So let's head over to our chase state first of all. Now here in fixed update, we already acquire a target, so all we need to do at this point is tell our enemy that his current target is equal to that target. That way every time we acquire a new target, the enemy's target gets set. We'll do the same thing in our idle state. Now when we return to enemy combat, we shouldn't be getting any error message, and we can now figure out the vector towards our enemy's target. Now we need to calculate an angle so it knows how much to rotate. This will be a float value, and here we're going to use some real math. We'll make a math function called atan2, and this will just take our fire directions y and its fire directions x values, and now it's going to multiply them by another math function, and this time we're just going to do radians to degrees. This will just calculate an actual degree value for us so that we can actually get our float or angle. At this point, we're almost done with the mathy stuff, except that our instantiate method needs a quaternion value in order to be able to rotate our actual projectile. And here we'll just use quaternion.Euler and just put in a 0 on the first two values, and then this should be angle that we just calculated, not rotation. I'll fix that in a moment. All right, with all that stuff done, we can actually make this happen. So we want to instantiate our projectile now, so we'll make a reference to it, game object, new projectile, and we'll just instantiate our config's projectile prefab. We'll do it at the attack points position and now pass along that rotation that we so painfully calculated just a moment ago. Now we do need to pass some values to the projectile itself. It needs to know things like its damage and lifetime and speed. So here we'll make a reference to that projectile script, and it's just going to be equal to the new projectile's get component projectile. Now then we can just tell the projectile that its damage is equal to our config's range damage value, and also that its lifetime is equal to our config's lifetime value. At this point I'll just fix that rotation value back to angle like I said I would, and finally we just need to actually give some velocity to our projectile. So down here we're going to grab first of all its rigid body. And here we'll just look on the new projectile and get component, rigid body 2D. And then we can tell that rigid body what its linear velocity should be, which is just going to be its fire direction multiplied by its config's projectile speed. We are close to finished now. If I go to my flyer's config, we can attach a projectile prefab, but we haven't actually made one yet. So let's go to our prefabs folder, where first of all, it's kind of full. So I'm going to create a folder here to clean up some of my target dummy stuff. I'll just call this one dummy and then drag in all of his prefabs. At that point, then we can drag our fireball down here. With the prefab made, we can go ahead and delete the fireball from our scene, go back to our flyer's config and drag that prefab into the slot there. Now at this point, if you run a test and nothing's happening, that's because we still need to set up our animation event. Let's click on the middle one here in attack, and this time we're going to call our enemy combat method, and we want to just perform ranged attack. Now when we get in the game, he will in fact be firing, but you'll notice it's not quite working as we would like. There's a couple of little setup things we didn't quite do here. So first of all, let's open our fireball prefab and make sure that we set its ground layer and its target layer so that it knows to destroy itself if it hits a wall and to deal damage if it hits the player. Also, in our capsule collider, we never set this as isTrigger, so we need it to run its isTrigger method, and we also don't want it bouncing off things. All right, with that done, when we get in the game, things are looking so much better. We've now got a fully functional second enemy, and it didn't take nearly as much time as that first one to set up. Now, one really important thing to remember anytime we add new code to a project is to make sure that our old mechanics are still working, and you'll notice here that mine are not. The main reason for this is just, you can see I'm getting a warning here that the shooting parameter doesn't exist. That means my kobold is trying to shoot. The reason for that, if I go to his config, is that he has all the default values for ranged attack set. If we turn those to zeros, we can run back over, and now he will never try to enter ranged attack state, and so that won't be a problem. I hope you've found this one helpful. If you have, please be sure to like the video, as it really does make a big difference when these videos get some likes and a few people actually watch them. We'll be continuing this series coming up soon. Please watch for those videos. Until then though, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.